exciting episode of Thrive Live. So today we have guest speaker Krysteena Stevens, and some of you may recognize her. Krysteena is now a licensed therapist residing in Boise, Idaho. She graduated in clinical psychology with a specialization in marriage and family therapy and has been practicing in a variety of settings for the past 8 years. Krysteena works with individuals, couples, families, with an intention of reducing distress and conflict by improving relationships and building self-confidence. So we're so excited to have Krysteena on today and to have her share some of her knowledge with us. So with that said, Krysteena, you can have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me, Jenny. It's so excited to be here. And you mentioned, some of you may recognize me, and that's basically because I used to work for you a long time ago. So for those who don't know, Jenny is my old boss. She was a great one, so it's good to reconnect. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of my specialty, which is relationships. And let me just share my screen to kind of help out with my talk. Okay, does that look good? Perfect. So as Jenny mentioned, I'm Krysteena, and I'm a licensed therapist. I practice in Boise, Idaho. For the last little less than a year, I've been doing mostly telehealth, thanks to the pandemic, for sessions, but I have a physical office space in Boise, and I'm actually in my office right now. I've been in private practice for a little bit over a year, and before that I worked in a variety of settings for the previous 8-ish or so years. I graduated in 2012. I worked for a nonprofit. Oh, now I can't figure out how to, oh, I'm on the wrong one, that's why. Sorry, technical issue. Okay, there we go. So in the past, I worked for a nonprofit. I worked in community mental health. I've done some work through our local jails and prisons. I worked with the homeless population in the homeless shelter for a bit. And I worked for a few years just after graduate school with at-risk youth and teens. And I've been in some other healthcare settings. So I've kind of been all across the board. And though I've worked with many different types of individuals from many different walks of life, my favorite thing to do is to help my clients now with anything involving relationships. So that could be relationships romantically, or family relationships, or even friendships or relationships at work, kind of encompassing all of those things. My graduate program that I went to provided a specialization actually in marriage and family therapy. So it basically taught me to look at people that I work with through the context of the systems and the relationships that they're involved in. I believe that humans are highly social creatures. And for those of you that know Brené Brown, to quote her, that we are hardwired for connection with others. So the history of the human species, we literally have depended on others for our survival. We're highly social creatures. So even though this idea of being connected and intertwined with other people may seem a bit in opposition to what I'm talking about today, which is basically about the power of ourselves in relationships. I just kind of want to preface this by saying that what I'm going to talk about today is sort of just one branch of the relationship tree, like a healthy relationship tree. So if we imagine relationships as, a tree with several strong branches that kind of hold up all the leaves, this is sort of just one section of that. I think it's a pretty important section, and it's one that I talk about with my clients very often, but there, are several different areas that kind of go into how do I have healthy relationships with others. So just something to keep in mind. So the objectives today. Today I'm going to break this idea down into 3 different parts. We'll talk quite a bit actually about attachment and attachment theory. That's going to be probably the biggest section. There's a lot to talk about in that area. So what it is, different types of attachment, and why it's important information to know about yourself. We're also going to talk about self-regulating, or sometimes I call it self-soothing, and what skills you can practice in order to help prevent escalating during conflict, and how to have healthier communication with your loved ones in your relationship. And then last, prioritizing you. So why is it important to still keep your own needs at the top of your priority list, and how taking care of yourself will allow you to show up better for others. The reason that I chose this as my topic for today is, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit later too, but the sort of misconception about relationships that I see very, very often in the people that I work with. I work with a lot of couples, and the couples will often come in and, talk about kind of what's going on, what their problems are, what they need help with. And they tend to point the finger at the other person a lot. It's just something sort of innate, I think, that we do, right? Like we want to hold our partner accountable for making us feel a certain way, or helping us in a certain way, or molding us in a certain way. And all of those things could be a benefit and could be important to relationships, but it's not the only component. So what I end up doing a lot of the times when I'm working with couples is breaking it down and kind of looking at, all of these little interactions and saying, okay, how much of this is something that you need to heal within yourself? And how much of this is actually something that you need from your partner? And more often than not, once they start really looking into themselves and kind of working on themselves and understanding what their triggers are, and, oh, this is why I do this, or this is why I present in this way, their relationship starts to improve. So I really just kind of wanted to focus on that today for our topic. So let's start with attachment theory. What is attachment theory? The term attachment in psychology was coined by John Bowlby, and he was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst in the late 50s. Well, he worked longer than that, but he kind of coined this term in the late 50s. He discovered this theory by primarily studying interactions with babies and their caregivers. And at this time, their caregivers were, primarily the mother. Especially with young babies, the mother tends to be also the source of food. So that's just kind of how the research formulated. He noticed subtle cues that babies and their mothers made toward each other. So when we're born, we're solely dependent on our caregiver, again, the mother typically, and we look to that person for comfort, for safety, for protection, and for security. And these needs are paramount throughout the most of our childhood. Bowlby specifically believed that there's a really strong impact between when babies were about 6 months to about 2 years old, and that the interactions that they had with their primary caregiver kind of followed them into more of their, youth and teen and adult lives. In the 60s and 70s, so a little bit after that, another psychologist came around, Mary Ainsworth, and she further developed this theory and created basic categories of attachment. These include anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and secure attachment. A little later, I think maybe in the 1980s, somewhere around there, another category was added, a fourth category called disorganized attachment. We're not really going to talk about that very much today because we're just going to kind of focus on the three main types of secure, anxious, and avoidant. But just for a note, disorganized attachment tends to be like a combination of anxious and avoidant attachment styles. And they say it's kind of a smaller percentage of the population. In the years that followed, this theory was further studied and applied to adults in romantic and other kinds of relationships. So all of these studies on babies, again, were sort of translated into youth and teens, and then people started getting really interested in, well, how does this play out in adult relationships, and how do we, by understanding this, how can we improve our adult relationships? In a super simple explanation, attachment theory is the idea of, if I wander away just a little bit to explore something, do I have the assurance that I can come back to a safe home and a secure base with my partner or with my caregiver? So in babies, Bowlby noticed this, again, by looking at subtle cues. So an example is when, babies are first learning to crawl, and maybe the mother kind of puts them down on the floor and they're sort of crawling away. You'll notice they'll crawl a little bit and then they'll turn their head and be like, oh, is my mom still there? Yep. Okay, good. And then they'll crawl a little bit more and say, oh, is she still there? Okay. So it's kind of this idea of like, let me go out and explore, but I need to know that you're still there to keep me safe in case I need someone to run back to. So it's just this feeling of reminding them that, okay, I'm safe and protected. So the secure attachment bonds were with the parents who let their children explore, but were always within a safe distance and who responded to their cues, just like the example I just gave. The idea of avoidant attachment stemmed from children who felt any type of neglect and who felt like their needs were not tended to. So an example of that would be if I cry and cry and cry and no one comes to comfort me, or if I go out exploring and kind of crawl away and no one comes to check on me or see where I'm at, or if I hurt myself and I need someone to be there and no one's there, then in theory, these children end up growing up to kind of think like, well, all I have is myself. And so I'm just going to have to be dependent and relying on myself because people aren't really going to be there to meet my needs. On the other end of that, sometimes the primary caregiver can sort of be too over-involved or like too into their children. And Bowlby noticed that if mothers were too close or too involved, so for example, if the mother was sort of like rubbing their face in their baby's face or overly touching, and the baby was obviously getting overstimulated and needed a break, and the mother kind of kept persisting, then again, in theory, this developed into more of this anxious attachment style. And what was interesting in these children is that when the mother left the room, the babies would, be in distress and they would cry out and say, oh, like, I need someone here. But then when the mothers would come back in to tend to their needs, the babies would be indifferent and they would just kind of look at them and be like, do I really want you here? I don't know. So it was sort of like this ambivalence that they noticed. So in securely attached parents and children, the mothers were basically just more in tune with their baby's needs. So when the babies felt overstimulated and needed space or exploration, they would back off and allow them space. When the babies needed comforting and security, the mothers were there. And again, I say mothers because that was just primarily who was involved in the studies. I do know that they've done some studies since then on same-sex couples, particularly with men. And I believe that whoever the primary caregiver was, so like whoever the primary male parent was that was kind of there the most, they saw the same things, but I would need to look a little further into the research, but I just kind of wanted to mention that. So now that we covered the brief history of like what attachment theory is, and that was really just sort of a very rough draft, you can look into it a little bit more. That was kind of like the SparkNotes version. But now that we covered that, you probably want to know more about how attachment theory plays out in adult relationships. So here's sort of what it looks like if you look at the screen ahead of you. What tends to happen often is anxious individuals pair up with avoidant individuals. And so let's first kind of describe what each section looks like, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what does anxious attachment in adult look like? They desire a lot of closeness in the relationship. They may fear rejection, insecurities, and jealousy. They feel unfulfilled when not in a relationship. They tend to play games to keep their partner's attention. So maybe there is what we call this protest withdrawal kind of attitude where they might do certain things to get the other person's attention, but then when they get the attention, they kind of run away. They have a difficulty expressing emotions clearly. They expect their partners to read what's on their mind or to kind of put their feelings into words for them. And they tend to be overly preoccupied with the relationship. Avoidant attachment styles tend to greatly value independence. They emphasize rigid boundaries within the relationship and tend to struggle with flexibility. They use physical or emotional distancing strategies. They hold an unrealistic view of a partner or relationship. So they're kind of like the grass is greener person in a relationship. They may like certain aspects of being in a relationship. They can even be in long-term relationships, but they're sort of always thinking like, well, is there something better out there? And they tend to avoid or shut down instead of sharing feelings. A secure attachment is kind of what we all hope for. That's like what we aim for. So secure attachment is someone who communicates needs and feelings openly and effectively. They seek compromise during conflict. They are unafraid of commitment or being dependent on another person. They desire closeness and security, and they aren't afraid of it. They tend to be reliable and consistent, and they have a flexible view of relationships. So they realize that, not all relationships are perfect. And if there's struggles, that's kind of just the normal part of being in a relationship rather than thinking, oh, something's wrong with my partner or this relationship is doomed. So what I mentioned before is that anxious individuals tend to partner up with avoidant individuals. And what ends up happening in those situations is they each become the triggers for each other. So the anxious person really desires closeness and security and connection and is like pushing kind of toward the avoidant individual, but those behaviors scare the avoidant individual. And so the avoidant individual is like, oh no, you're being too clingy or you're too overwhelming. So like I have to back away. So if you can see me on, wherever my little picture is on the screen, sometimes I like to use this rubber band example. And if the avoidant individual is kind of pushing away, they're really only bringing the anxious individual closer. So it's kind of like this game of pursuer distancer, and they're never really able to break that cycle until they become aware of what they're doing and are more conscious about changing that. So researching this and understanding this about yourself and what category you might fall into can be really, really helpful in your relationships. So understanding your natural attachment style can also help you work toward forming a more secure attachment with a partner, or at least searching for a partner who has a secure attachment style. One thing I also notice when I'm working with people is that, again, just kind of going back to this idea of maybe I feel insecure about myself, or I lack self-esteem, I lack confidence, or I've been in a lot of traumatic relationships. And so I want to get into a relationship with someone who is going to heal me from all of those things, right? They're going to remind me that like, oh, it's good to be in a relationship and it's okay to need someone. It's okay to want someone, which yes, our relationships can heal us from past dysfunctional relationships. But if you rely on your partner solely to do that for you, you're going to be disappointed every time, because that's just too big of a burden to bear for people. Like we don't want to get into a relationship where we're expecting our partner to fix us and to fix all of our wounds. And we wouldn't really want the other way around either. So I want to do a little bit of a game here. Also, if you can see my screen, this is the book. It's called Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller, that a lot of this information was taken from. It's a relatively new book. If you're interested in learning more about attachment styles in adult relationships, I definitely recommend this one. And I just want to read an excerpt out of here. And for those who are participating, or maybe Jenny, if you wanted to chime in your answer, you can let me know what you think this is. So I'm going to read a little mini case study, and then based on what we just talked about, let me know what attachment style you think that this person has. Does that sound okay? Okay. So this is Janet. She's single. She's 23. I finally met a great guy, a really great guy. Tim and I have been out together twice, and I already feel myself falling in love. It's so hard to find someone I'm compatible with. I'm only attracted to a certain type of man. And then what are the chances that he'll also find me attractive? The odds are against me on this one. So now that I've met Tim, I want to make sure I do everything right. I can't afford to make any mistakes. One wrong move and I could jeopardize the entire relationship. I'm waiting for him to set the pace because I don't want to seem too eager. So maybe I'll send him a text. Would that be okay? That might seem kind of laid back and spontaneous, don't you think? Or maybe I'll forward him some funny email as part of a distribution list. So thinking about and kind of looking at this screen, what attachment style do you think that Janet falls into?
Anxious.
Yes, good job. So the answer is anxious. She seeks closeness, feels incomplete on her own, and is very preoccupied with the relationship. So granted, on the first few dates, people of all different attachment styles get excited about the other person and think about them a lot. That's pretty normal. However, with Janet, it goes a step further. So she views relationships as rare and fragile and believes that any small inappropriate act on her part has the capacity to ruin them. So therefore, she turns over in her head every move she makes countless times so as not to make a mistake. She also chooses to let Tim set the tone and pace of the relationship. Last, because she's insecure, she plays games by considering ways of indirectly getting in touch with Tim without putting herself out on the line and being vulnerable. So good job, Jenny. You win 5 points. Okay, so back to this slide. Oh, sorry, we're not there yet. Okay. So the reason that this is such an important work to do on your own, because remember we're talking about, the power of self in relationships, is that it's good because you can be a better partner and you can have more fulfilling relationships if you just kind of know, okay, this is what I tend to lean toward. How can I recognize these things in myself so that I'm not so reactive, or that I don't run away, or that I, try and sit with the conversation a little bit longer so that I can be more present, more available for my partner. And also B, like we talked about before, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get into a relationship and your partner's going to say, hey, like, I kind of see some signs of an anxious attachment style in you. Like, would you like some help working on that? That's probably not going to happen. What's going to happen is your partner's going to get burnt out, no matter what side you're on. And the relationship's probably not going to end up working out. Or worst case scenario, if you're married, it could lead to significant problems in the relationship, or, even in worst cases, divorce down the line. So another reason is just knowing and understanding these things about yourself will prevent you, again, from making kind of the same recurring mistakes in your future relationships. So sometimes we have this idea that, oh, if I leave this relationship that was so awful, I'm going to get into another relationship and this person's going to be better and everything's going to be great with them. But if the problem is coming from you, or, part of the problem is coming from you, that problem is going to follow you in all of your relationships going forward. So you may get out of a relationship, get into a new relationship, and the new relationship is great for 6 months, a year, whatever, and then you start to notice the same problems are coming back up, right? And then you kind of have to stop and take a look at yourself, be like, all right, what do I contribute to this, right? How am I putting myself in this situation, or how am I contributing to this negative relationship style? Something that's kind of a pro and con in our relationships today is that they are really intertwined in our identity. If we look at relationships, 100 plus years ago, maybe even a little bit less than that, we often married for things that weren't specifically love. Like, we hoped that love would come out of them, but we married for status, we married for money, we married for land, we married for, property, or because our parents said, hey, you're going to marry this guy over here or this gal over here, because they sort of match with our family values and what we want. So there was just less of a choice and almost like less pressure in a way, which there's a lot of downsides to that, right? Like, it's better now that we have more say in who we fall into our relationships with, but it has become something that's so intertwined in who we are. Like, we date for longer periods of time, we date more people, we get married later, or we commit later. And we mull around with this idea. We talk to our friends and our families and other people of like, is this person the one, right? And so there's a big weight and a big decision on who we end up sharing our life with. And again, although that can be really good, if that relationship tends to, doesn't work out, it takes a little piece of our identity with it. And that can be really, really, really devastating for people, because we have, created this idea of, okay, I'm making the right decision by choosing this person to be my life partner. And if that doesn't work out, then sometimes we tend to look at ourselves and say, well, what's wrong with me? Like, do I not know how to make decisions? How could I have made the wrong decision? How could I think this person was someone, but really they were someone else? And so you start questioning and just kind of the spiral continues. So it's just, again, something to kind of keep in mind. I like to also talk about how relationships are a balance between autonomy and togetherness. And I like to use this rubber band symbol again, which this idea of autonomy and togetherness relates directly to like attachment theory and attachment styles. So you don't want to be too far away from each other where you're too separate and too avoided, because there's too much tension on that line. But then if you're too close and too overwhelmed, then the relationship structure, which is supposed to be the rubber band, kind of just falls apart, right? It falls down. So you want to have a healthy amount of kind of tension right there where you can move closer and be there for each other, but you can also feel free to kind of be yourself and have your own sense of identity within the relationship. Okay. Now that we've talked about attachment styles, let's move on to the second objective of self-regulating. So what is self-regulating? I use the term self-regulating and self-soothing kind of interchangeably a lot because sometimes I feel like self-soothing is a little bit easier to imagine what we mean by that. So literally knowing how to soothe ourselves when we're angry or upset or sad or frustrated or we're feeling really overwhelmed in emotion. How do you kind of tune in and soothe yourself and help calm yourself down? Knowing your attachment style can help with this. So if you lean more toward the anxious side of attachment, you might think, okay, so I tend to feel really uneasy when my partner says or does this thing that triggers my feelings of neglect or abandonment. So rather than immediately running toward your partner and trying to fix the problem or trying to get that reassurance from them, you can stop yourself and think, okay, let me calm myself down. Let me think about, is this something that I can kind of turn inward and sort of help heal myself in this moment? And then when I'm feeling more calm, I can come to my partner later and talk about, okay, this really bothered me. I want to talk to you about it. How can we come to a solution? Rather than like immediately reacting. This can also respond to this can also apply to how we respond to our children. I have a kind of a good example. Someone kind of in my world was telling me a story the other day about how she reacted to her young daughter. I think her daughter is like around 4 or 5 years old. And she was telling me the story about how they were getting ready in the morning and it was like a busy morning. They were already running kind of late, trying to get everyone dressed and out of the house. And her daughter comes up to her with, I think it was like a necklace that was tangled up. And she's like, Mom, can you help me untangle this necklace? I really want to wear this today. And the mom was like, you know what? We're super busy. We just got to get out of the house. We have like 10 minutes. Put that on the kitchen table. I will help you with that later tonight. And the daughter responds back and says, well, fine. I'll just go ask grandma and grandma will help me with it. And the mom immediately felt triggered and, wanted to respond to that and say, why are you so ungrateful? Like, I help you with all these other things. Like, just because I can't do this one thing doesn't mean you need to like be snappy with me. But she had also been doing a lot of work on, meditation and mindfulness and kind of noticing her triggers and self-regulating. And so she was able to stop herself and think, okay, just because I can't tend to this right now doesn't mean I'm a bad mom. Just because my daughter is trying to get a need met and she wants to go ask grandma to get that need met doesn't have anything to do with me. And so she was able to really let that go and just respond with saying, okay, that's fine. Go ask grandma, and it prevented this really big, like kind of emotional moment between the two of them. So the next section is identifying thoughts and emotions. So expanding awareness in ourselves and what is going on in our bodies is basically what that kind of means. So how do we do that? How do we identify, the thoughts that are going on in our head, which are like a million a day, and then how do we become more in tune with our emotions? Therapy, obviously, is a huge way to do that. That's kind of what we talk about all day with our clients and just exploring that more and expanding those parts of your brain. Journaling is really great, putting your thoughts on paper. I think a lot of times just using journaling as a medium, you can put things on paper that you don't necessarily realize even what you're thinking. Like, it's kind of amazing what will come out in our writing that we didn't realize was going on in our heads. Reading books is super helpful, whether that's like a self-help book that you really like or focusing on things primarily about increasing consciousness, increasing awareness, increasing emotional intelligence, and then just taking time to kind of tune into ourselves and look inward. I talk about that a lot. And what that basically means is just pausing, right? So throughout the day, we go, and we have all these thoughts that are going through our heads. And sometimes it can be so powerful just to literally stop, take a second, take a deep breath, try and tune inward and just notice, okay, how am I feeling? How did this thing in front of me make me feel? And can I name that? Even something as simple as practicing like naming your emotions out loud. Sometimes I have clients do that. I'll give them like a feelings wheel. And this works really well with kids too, but I'll give them a feelings wheel and have them just pick an emotion throughout the day. So one time a day, they'll look at the feelings wheel and say, okay, I feel frustrated today. And just to say that out loud and acknowledge that, and not to necessarily do anything with it, but just to say, all right, yeah, today is kind of a frustrating day. That's okay. I can be okay with that, you know, and learning to like accept kind of how they feel. So that can be really helpful. The next one is knowing your window of tolerance. So again, if you can kind of look at my screen, wherever my little box falls in your computer screen, let's say that where my hands are your ideal or like your optimal window of tolerance. So if this is your ideal or your optimal window of tolerance and you start your day and maybe you have a flat tire, you're like, okay, well that sucks, but I can fix it. And then you get on the road and there's traffic and you're like, ugh, yeah, it's a bummer, but I can still get to work. And then your boss wants to talk to you about something. And then you get home and you realize you don't have everything that you need for dinner. And then, you know, your child is screaming or your partner is in a bad mood or something like that. And all these little things happen throughout the day. And yeah, they're kind of a bummer, but because your window of tolerance is this big, you can manage those things. You're like, yeah, it was hard, but I got through it. I was okay. If you have a history of like trauma, neglect, even like low self-esteem, all of these different things that decrease your window of tolerance, those things that happen throughout your day could fall outside of that and could just send you off the rails. Being aware, I think, of what your window of tolerance is and kind of what you can handle is also really intertwined with like just becoming more aware of yourself too. Like if I know that every little thing is going to set me off, how do I expand this window just a little bit today? And then how do I expand it a little bit tomorrow and a little bit the next day and a little bit the next day until you can get to a place where you feel confident enough to handle all of life's stressors so that they're not quite as challenging. And, you know, even healing, if you have a trauma history, healing from that past trauma. So that way, again, you're not having all of these triggers kind of come up throughout the day. On that note, practicing mindfulness and relaxation skills regularly can be really helpful with all of these things. I really like to talk about mindfulness a lot in my practice. And sometimes I think that, even though it's kind of a common term that people use these days, I think that sometimes people are scared of it a little bit too, because they think of mindfulness as meditation and, oh, I need to be able to sit in a room for 6 hours and clear my entire brain of all the thoughts that I've ever had. And that's just not really realistic unless you're like a Buddhist monk. So mindfulness is a really great way to just focus on taking little moments throughout the day to feel yourself being present. So when I talk about this with people, we'll start with really, really simple things like putting a timer on for 3 minutes and just noticing your breath and not doing anything with it, like literally just noticing your breath. Or the next time you're doing chores like putting away the dishes or vacuuming or dusting, to just focus on what am I doing right now? How does this feel? You know, what is the temperature? What are the steps that I'm kind of doing, going through, you know, like taking the fork out and putting the fork away and just focusing on whatever you're doing, whatever that task is at hand right at that moment. It's kind of learning to track your thinking and becoming more aware of your thoughts. And then also not putting so much weight or pressure on the things that you're thinking. Because a lot of the times, you know, our thoughts are automatic. We can't really control everything that comes into our head, but we can control how much power they have over us, and we can control, you know, how they impact us and how we express them. Okay, So let's talk about self-regulating in conflict. The things we talked about on the previous slide were things that you can do sort of preventatively, which I think are really good in order to help reduce the amount of conflict that we have in relationships or with our loved ones. But let's say that you do those things and you have a day that's just really rough and you end up getting into a conflict with someone, whether that's your partner or again, a colleague or your child or whatever it is. How do you learn to self-regulate in those moments when you're already feeling triggered or heated, so that way you can prevent it from becoming this big blowout? So the first one is identify when you are feeling escalated and then try to slow down the process. For this, most people will say their 0 to 60 is like a second, even less than a second, right? They hear their partner say something and they're automatically like in fighting mode. They're like, oh no, that was not good. Like I have to attack back. This is going to be bad, and their brain is like already rolling with all of these things that they're going to say back. But if we were to break that down and slow that down, there's probably 10 steps that happen between when the person says something and when you feel triggered. So I try to get people to tune into their body by noticing, what is your heart doing? Is it beating fast? Do you feel heat or do you get like sweaty palms? Do you feel flushed? Do you notice a shortness of breath? Do you feel any tightening or clenching anywhere in your body? Do you feel pain anywhere? A lot of people will say, my shoulders get really tense, or like I clench my jaw, or sometimes I even like feel pain in my stomach. So we kind of slow that down and try to notice what is the very, very first thing that you feel when you feel triggered, and then start to notice what that is so that way you can stop yourself before you react. If you can identify, kind of what those little micro steps are, then you can stop yourself and you can take a time out. This is super helpful in conflict because a lot of us want to solve the problem right now, right? Like something comes up and we're like, we just have to talk it out. I have to hash it out. And that's just how I solve things. But again, if you're stuck in those like attachment styles where maybe you're on the anxious side, you say, I really just need to talk about this. And I need to like be reassured that my partner is there. And so I just, I can't sleep until this problem is solved. But then if your partner is on the avoidance side, they're going to say, nope, I want nothing to do with this. I'm going to run away and we're not going to talk about this right now. And it just kind of ends up creating more conflict. So if you can both agree, okay, if we're feeling heated or if we're feeling like this is escalating, we're both going to take a time out and we're going to come back together when we're both feeling calm, we're both feeling clear-headed, and we can have an actual productive conversation. During the timeout, it's really important to use self-soothing techniques and not to dwell on the conflict. So some people will think, okay, well, I'm going to take a timeout and then I'm going to call my best friend and I'm just going to like trash my partner and all the horrible things that they just said to me. But that just kind of sends us deeper down the spiral. So I try and get people to, again, use those self-regulating tools, use those self-soothing tools, do something like go for a walk, exercise, listen to music, draw, read, take a bath, anything that's going to get their mind off of what they just walked away from. Because if you can switch the way, or switch like, the thing that your mind is stuck in, again, it's going to calm itself down, and then you're going to be able to come back to the conversation and have a more productive conversation later. The last one that we talked about, scheduling a time to come back to talk about the conflict when you feel calm. This is a really, really, really important thing because if you think, okay, I'm just going to take a time out and then it's just going to go away and we're going to forget about it, like that's not really solving the problem. It's going to come back. And whether that's tomorrow or the next day or a week or a month from now, that problem that you're trying to run away from is going to come back to you. So it's really, really important that you make an agreement, with your partner or with this loved one that we're going to take a time out. Let's give ourselves a day. Let's schedule some time tomorrow evening and we're going to talk about this. So that way we make sure the problem gets addressed. So, just one more thing actually on this last slide. I want to just talk about how maybe, some of these ideas seem sort of simple or maybe like common sense in nature, But if you've ever been in this place, like, you know that it's not easy. You know that once your brain gets to the point where you're feeling triggered, it's really hard to slow yourself down. So that's why, again, doing a lot of these preventative things is really helpful, of just self-soothing, taking time for yourself, practicing the meditation and mindfulness and relaxation. All of that stuff can help decrease, the amount that you're triggered. So this brings us to our last topic, and that's prioritizing you and your needs. Jenny, I know that you are kind of big on this. You talk about this a lot with your patients on, sort of taking care of yourself and showing up for yourself, trying to put your health as a priority so that way you can be there for those that you love. And that's super, super important. So we all know by now what self-care is. Like, it's kind of like a trending term. We understand it. We know that we need it in our lives. But it's interesting to me to see how many people actually prioritize that. And I kind of have a personal opinion that we've sort of skewed this idea of what self-care is. Like, we think that self-care is, oh, I have to have massages all the time, or I have to, be involved in this club that meets every week, or I have to spend all of this time, doing these things for myself in order to make myself feel better. But if we're busy and we have families and we have jobs and we have responsibilities, like, trying to add an extra hour into the week sometimes seems so overwhelming that we don't even think about it. We're like, I don't even have time to think about myself, so I'm not going to. But self-care really doesn't need to be a big thing. In most of my first sessions with my clients, I like to ask, what do you do for yourself? And again, some people are pretty good at this, and they'll say, oh, I'm in a book club, or I like to cook. I really like cooking and experimenting with food and baking, or I go mountain biking on the weekends. They can kind of come up with that sort of thing. But I'd say the vast majority of people really get stumped with this question, or they say, oh, I used to exercise, but then I had 2 kids and I haven't been to the gym in 3 years, or I used to be really involved in clubs in school, and then I got into the working world and I'm really not involved in anything anymore. So, they kind of use these reasons of, I don't have time, I have a demanding job, I have kids, I have a household to manage, but it really doesn't need to take a lot of time. And the act of self-care can be more of an intention, as long as it has an emotional, physical, spiritual, or mental component to it. It's self-care. It's considered self-care. Another thing that I hear often from people is, if I do this thing for myself, I end up feeling guilty because I should be spending more time focusing on my work, or I should be spending more time focusing on my children or focusing on my partner. And what ends up happening is that we end up doing all of these things for other people, and we wear ourselves out, like our cup goes empty. And then we have nothing to give for ourselves, and we start to feel resentment, really. So to further expand on that, why is self-care so important? It's super important for our physical and mental health. It can minimize the risk of disease or chronic health concerns. Showing up and being present for others is a lot easier to do when we feel like our cup is full and like we have, the confidence and the fulfillment in our lives. It can help us feel balanced and happy. There's also this notion of how can you really show up for other people if you have a difficult time taking care of yourself? Role modeling, again, people think, I have to give all of these things to my children because children just have unlimited amount of needs. But taking care of yourself and showing your children this is what self-love looks like is going to be more powerful for them than doing everything for everyone else except for yourself. And I think people forget that a lot. So another thing in role modeling is showing others, if I can do it, you can do it. We're all just humans trying to get through every day the best we can. And none of us, are any better than the other when it comes to this. And this can even translate into being an example to employees at work. So if you work in a culture where it's just go, go, go all the time. And let's say you're in like a boss or a supervisory position, like you can work toward changing that culture. You can show your employees like this is what it looks like to have a work-life balance. Eliminating resentment, like I mentioned, if I feel good about myself and my life, what you do is going to have less of an impact on me. So I'm not going to resent you because I'm doing all of these things for you, because I'm also focusing on myself and what that means. And I just want to really quick also give some examples of what it means to practice self-care in a really, really small way. So if you're feeling really overwhelmed by the idea of self-care, or if you can't answer that question really quickly of like, what do I do for myself? People have given me the response of, I walk to work sometimes on nice days and I like to look at the flowers. Or I get up 20 minutes earlier than the rest of my household and I enjoy a cup of coffee. Or on my lunch break, I take 5 minutes and I put on, some relaxing music and I just sit in my car for 5 minutes, and that feels really nourishing to me. So it can literally be anything that feels like it fills your cup and restores you. Like that is what self-care is. If you're interested in learning more about this or more about relationships, you can definitely keep in touch with me. My website is www.treecitywellnessid.com. There's also a newsletter you can sign up for. When you go on the homepage, there's a little like pop-up thing that comes up, and you can add your name and sign up for our newsletter. You can also follow me on social media. I have a Facebook and an Instagram account. So either of those. And that is all I have for you all today.
Thank you. I love everything that you spoke about. And from my personal side, it probably took me about 5 years of counseling to get to the point of actually being able to put self-care in my calendar, because I had to figure out, why would I not put myself first? Like, why would I always put everyone else first? And, and we always, we're told in school, and we know that we can't heal others, we can't help others until we heal ourselves first. And so, there can be a lot of roadblocks that come up for us as we go through trying to actually incorporate self-care. And it's so important to actually flag the roadblock or that thought, so we can think about it and where it's coming from.
Yeah. And I think behind a lot of that, we do tend to feel like shame and guilt, right? For whatever reason, a lot of us, we're conditioned to feel bad about thinking about ourselves. Again, because I have so many other things on my plate and I have so many other people I need to take care of. Like, I can't think about myself right now. But by focusing on yourself, you are really making your capacity to serve others like so much greater. And that's, so important, obviously, in the helping professions too. Just, Jenny, you being a doctor and me being a counselor, and like we have to think about these things a little bit extra sometimes, I think. So.
And I love how you talked about how self-care can be so simple and quick, right? It doesn't have to be a 2-hour bike ride, which I would love, but not doable every day to go on a 2-hour bike ride. And so I loved how you talked about, okay, it's just being intentional with that cup of coffee. It's being intentional for just stretching for 5 minutes. It's so easy to incorporate things. It doesn't need to be this big vacation to reincorporate self-care. We can do little steps.
Yeah, exactly. I really had to think about that and kind of restructure that in my life lately, just like on a personal note, because I'm 35 weeks pregnant, and my self-care used to be getting outside. Like I would be on the trails every weekend. Like I loved camping and all of these things, which is also a lot easier to do here in the spring, summer, and fall. And winter, it's pretty cold and wet, so can't really go on the trails. But and I just don't have the endurance right now, obviously, that I used to, 8 months ago. So I've had to turn the idea of self-care into, okay, if I'm having a good day, I'm going to do something productive, and I'm going to do something that's been on my list and it's going to make me feel good to get it done. But if I'm having a day where I feel tired or lethargic, like I'm going to rest. So my self-care recently has just been tuning into my body and tuning into myself, and just kind of tracking myself on a day-to-day, like, how do I feel today? What do I feel like is realistic for me to accomplish? And then not feeling guilty about those days where I do rest. So that's been kind of a big theme in my life lately.
I'm proud of you.
Oh, thanks. So nice.
Because I think also, with all of the COVID changes to all of our lives, we can't go to the gym anymore like we wanted to, or we
Yeah.
can't do maybe some of the self-care that we did before, and we have to reframe and restructure what is self-care to us in this moment, and how can I do it in a way that's going to keep me safe from getting COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been so hard to think about too. And social supports, I mean, that's really struggled over the last year. That's been another thing that I've been really intentional about, like reaching out to people, even if I can't see them in person. Like, am I texting them? Am I calling them? Am I video chatting with them? And trying to keep that as a part of my life, which again, it's just something that falls off really easily, in our lives because we get caught up with other things. So
Yeah. And now more than ever, just with our friends who we maybe haven't, talked to in 5 years, it's just that text, that call. It's so welcoming in this day and age.
Yeah. Feels good.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved everything you talked about, because it's so important to understand where our emotions are coming from, and to understand ourselves before we can go and understand other people. So,
Mhm.
kids, husband, wife, coworkers,
Mhm.
family, friends, because then overall we're more present. We have more solid friendships, relationships with all those around us. Then we're having a more fulfillment
Yeah.
in ourselves, fulfillment in our community, our connection. We're connecting on a deeper level. Yeah, it all starts with ourselves.
Yeah. When we're living like, kind of a more toxic lifestyle that can bleed onto other people around us. Same thing goes if we're living a positive, intentional, like focusing on self-fulfillment lifestyle, that can bleed in a good way onto people around us too. So, yeah.
Totally.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you so much. And that was fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
And everyone have a wonderful weekend. We will see you back next week. All right, take care.